Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are going to zero in on something I think we've all kind of navigated in some way, relationship red flags.
Yeah.
And we have gathered insights from a lot of really fascinating sources that I think will help us all kind of better understand if those gut feelings or specific actions we're noticing are just part of like the usual, relationship ebb and flow, or if they're actually genuine warning signs, for our emotional well-being.
Right.
And I think that's kind of our mission today, right?
Exactly. I mean, we all want those strong, healthy connections. But sometimes I think we are so, you know, invested or optimistic
Oh, yeah.
that we might overlook certain cues,
Right.
certain subtle cues that could signal potential problems down the line. And so really what we want to do today is help you fine-tune that ability to recognize those cues.
Yeah, and I think, when we're talking about red flags, we're not talking about the occasional disagreement
Right.
or like, minor irritations or, just sort of like the ups and downs.
The normal ebb and flow of any relationship.
We're focusing on deeper patterns. That suggests potential trouble in how you and your partner connect, how much respect is present, the level of trust,
Right.
and ultimately how the relationship impacts your emotional health,
I think so.
you know?
Yeah.
So I think like one way to think about this is like, it's like trying to differentiate between, a pebble in your shoe
Hmm.
and like a cracked engine block, you know?
I love that.
Like there's things that you can just sort of like live with.
Right.
And then there are things that like are really gonna cause damage.
Yeah, and to extend that metaphor even further,
Right.
consider these red flags as those initial warnings on a car's dashboard.
Right.
That small light might flicker.
Yeah.
You could ignore it.
Yeah.
But that could lead to a much bigger, more costly breakdown later.
Yeah.
And similarly, those uneasy feelings or those behaviors in a relationship, if consistently ignored, can escalate into significant issues
Right.
down the line.
And the really, I think, crucial thing to remember here is that spotting a red flag isn't about immediately ending things.
Right.
It's about acknowledging it.
Exactly.
Like these are signals that deserve your attention.
Right.
Your reflection and open conversation, just sweeping them under the rug rarely makes them disappear.
Yeah.
In fact, it often allows them to grow.
Precisely. So let's get down to brass tacks.
Yeah.
What actually constitutes a red flag in a relationship?
Right.
So at its heart, it's really any indicator, a behavior you observe, a recurring pattern in communication,
Right.
a persistent feeling you have that suggests something fundamental isn't quite right.
Mm-hmm.
It points to potential issues brewing in those core areas we just mentioned, how you communicate the level of respect, the foundation of trust, and your overall emotional well-being within the relationship.
Right. And to bring that car analogy back for just a moment,
Yeah.
These red flags are like those early, less obvious signals.
Mhm.
It's not like the full siren, blaring. It's like a nudge saying, hey, something here needs a closer look. Maybe it's a slight wobble in the tires or a dip in performance.
Right.
Ignoring it might seem easier in the short term,
Yeah.
but it definitely increases the risk of a major problem, maybe even a complete stall in the relationship down the road.
That's it.
Right.
That's the critical point we want to emphasize here.
Yeah.
It can be tempting to dismiss these early signs,
Oh, yeah.
to rationalize them away by saying things like, oh, they didn't mean it like that, or to simply hope
Right.
that they'll just magically resolve themselves.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But consistently ignoring red flags is detrimental to your emotional health
Yeah.
and the long-term prospects of the relationship.
Yeah.
It's like driving with that warning light on and just hoping for the best.
Yeah.
A strategy that rarely ends well.
Right.
Rarely ends well.
Okay, so we have a sense of what red flags are in theory.
Yeah.
Let's delve in to some of the really common ones that people tend to miss. Sometimes because they don't recognize them as problems, and sometimes, if we're being honest, because they really, really want the relationship to work.
Mm-hmm.
And they just are kind of like, I don't know, willfully,
Blind to them.
Yeah.
Putting on the blinders.
Right. So let's kick things off with something called love bombing.
Ah, yes. Love bombing.
Oh, I love this one. This is so good.
So this can be particularly tricky because on the surface, it often feels like a dream come true
right.
in the beginning.
Yeah.
It's characterized by this overwhelming surge of affection very early on.
Right.
Think like intense declarations of love right off the bat.
Mm.
Extravagant gifts even when it doesn't feel earned.
Oh, yeah.
Constant praise that can feel a bit over the top.
Yeah.
And a strong push for very rapid commitment.
It's like you're being swept off your feet. kind
Exactly.
of whirlwind romance. It's like the stuff of movies, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And who wouldn't want to feel that kind of intense attention and
Exact.
adoration, especially in those early stages,
Right.
you know? But here's where I think it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
While expressing affection and enthusiasm is totally, part of a new relationship, with love bombing, the intensity feels out of sync with how well you actually know each other.
Right.
It can feel less like genuine affection that's kind of like grown organically
Right.
and more like this, almost like a strategic attempt to quickly create a very strong dependency
Right.
or gain control.
Right.
And
Exactly. And it's the speed and the sheer volume of this quote unquote love,
right.
the key indicators here.
Mm.
A real connection builds gradually, layer by layer.
Mm.
Love bombing, on the other hand, often feels rushed, and it can be quite one-sided,
Right.
focusing heavily on showering one person with attention,
Yeah.
while perhaps not showing a reciprocal interest in truly understanding them.
Right.
So consider this. Someone saying, I'm falling in love with you, or even a full-blown, I love you after only knowing you for a very short time,
Right.
like a week, as our source points out,
Yeah.
isn't typically a sign of a deeply rooted emotional connection.
Right.
It's a red flag that suggests they might be trying to manipulate you or are operating on a very unhealthy emotional timeline.
Right.
So beyond that surface flattery,
Right.
what's often happening is an attempt to create this powerful immediate bond that bypasses genuine connection,
Right.
potentially masking insecurities or even manipulative tendencies in the long run.
Right.
It's less about truly valuing you and more about quickly securing someone.
Right.
Right.
Okay. Moving on. Another really common but often ignored red flag
Yep.
is controlling behavior. Now, this one can sometimes wear the disguise of caring or concern,
Right.
which makes it extra challenging to identify.
Yeah, that's a crucial point to understand here.
Hmm.
Control rarely shows up as outright aggression at the beginning.
Right.
It often starts much more subtly,
Hmm.
perhaps with constant, seemingly innocent questions
Right.
about where you are, who you're spending your time with, or what you're doing.
Yeah.
The partner might try to make you feel guilty for wanting some alone time to recharge, or for pursuing your own individual interest outside the relationship.
It's that persistent feeling of being monitored
Right.
or having to excessively justify your actions and choices.
That's it.
And while it might be framed as, I just care about you so much,
Mm-hmm.
or I worry about your safety, the underlying motivation is often about exerting power
Yeah.
and gradually limiting your independence within the relationship.
And the major warning sign here to watch out for is how your partner reacts when you make independent decisions.
Right.
Whether it's making plans with friends, pursuing a hobby that's important to you, or even just deciding what to watch on TV
Right.
without their direct input.
Right.
If they consistently become upset, resentful, or try to make you feel guilty
Yeah.
for making choices that don't directly involve them,
Yeah.
that's a significant red flag waving.
Right.
It indicates this fundamental lack of respect for your autonomy
Right.
and a desire to control aspects of your life.
Right.
And I think it's interesting how, that intense, almost overwhelming start
Oh, yeah.
of love bombing we talked about earlier can
Mhm.
sometimes be a precursor
Right.
to this very insidious red flag controlling behavior.
Yeah.
Because once that initial dependency is established,
Right.
those attempts to exert control can become more subtle
Right.
and even harder to resist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then there's the classic lack of accountability. This is the person who, no matter what happens, can never, ever seem to admit they're wrong.
Right.
It's always someone else's fault. Their ex was crazy. Their boss is perpetually unfair.
Yeah.
Their job is overwhelmingly stressful.
Right.
Or even in a truly twisted scenario, somehow your fault.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Right.
Yeah. This consistent pattern of deflecting blame
Right.
and never taking responsibility for their own actions
Yeah.
is incredibly damaging to the foundation of any healthy relationship.
Right.
It essentially prevents any real resolution of conflict
Yeah.
because they lack the ability to see their own role in it.
Right.
Right? And it also inevitably puts you in a position where you're constantly carrying the weight of their issues and never receiving any validation
Right.
or acknowledgement of your own feelings or concerns
Yeah.
when problems arise.
And our source really nails it with this example.
Okay.
If you consistently find that every disagreement, every argument somehow ends with you offering an apology,
Right.
Even if the whole thing started with something your partner clearly did or said,
Yeah.
that is a huge reason to run,
Yeah.
as the thesaurus pointedly puts it.
Right.
It's a crystal clear sign that they are unwilling to take ownership of their behavior and are very likely to continue this deeply unhealthy pattern.
Exactly.
And that inability to take responsibility we just discussed often manifests in another really damaging way.
Okay.
A lack of respect for your personal boundaries.
Yes.
If someone can't admit they're wrong, they're also likely to dismiss your feelings and your limits.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that creates a significant imbalance of power
Right.
within the relationship.
Right.
And it actively prevents healthy conflict resolution,
Right.
which, as you know, is essential for any lasting and fulfilling connection.
Right.
Moving on. Let's talk about disrespecting boundaries.
Yes.
Now, boundaries are those invisible but crucial lines
Right.
that we draw that define what we are comfortable with, what feels acceptable to us.
Yeah.
And healthy relationships are built on a foundation of mutual respect
Right.
for those boundaries.
Right. We all have different limits,
Exactly.
different comfort levels.
Right.
And a truly respectful partner will not only acknowledge those, but will actively honor them.
Right.
However, there are some individuals who will consistently test those boundaries,
Right.
almost to see how far they can push,
Yeah.
what they can get away with.
That's it.
It might start with seemingly small things,
Right.
but it can definitely escalate and erode your sense of safety and self-respect over time.
Yeah.
And the specific example our source provides, I think, is particularly insightful here. If you explicitly express discomfort with something your partner does or says,
Right.
you clearly state, I really don't like it when you do that.
Yeah.
And they dismiss your feelings and your stated boundary with a response like, oh, you're just being too sensitive.
Right.
Or you're totally overreacting.
Exactly.
That's not just a simple difference of opinion.
Right.
It's a direct dismissal of your very valid emotions and a clear violation of the boundary you've just tried to establish.
Yeah, our source correctly identifies this as gaslighting,
Yeah.
which is a form of manipulation where someone tries to make you doubt your own memory,
Yeah.
your perception, and even your sanity.
Yeah.
It's definitely not love.
Right.
And it's a major red flag that should not be ignored.
Right. And finally, in this section, let's touch on that truly awful and unsettling feeling of constantly walking on eggshells around your partner. I think a lot of people listening can probably relate to this on some level, even if they haven't specifically identified it with that phrase,
Right.
you know?
So this feeling arises when you find yourself constantly censoring yourself.
Right.
What you say, what you do, even what you think and feel.
Right.
Because you are in persistent fear of your partner's negative reaction.
Right.
Whether that manifests as anger, silent withdrawal, or some other form of emotional punishment.
Yeah.
And it essentially creates an atmosphere of constant tension,
Right.
anxiety,
Yeah.
and uncertainty
Right.
within the supposed safe space of the relationship.
Right. Living in constant fear like that within a relationship erodes your sense of self
It's exactly.
and can lead to, chronic stress,
Right.
anxiety,
Yeah. Yeah.
essentially turning your safe haven into a danger zone.
Yeah.
It's a significant indicator that the fundamental security needed
Yeah.
in a partnership is absent. Right. And the really, I think, crucial thing here is that a healthy relationship should be a primary source of comfort, support, and a sense of emotional safety.
Right.
Not a place where you feel like you're constantly navigating a dangerous minefield.
Exactly.
If you consistently find yourself on edge,
Right.
meticulously choosing your words and carefully monitoring your actions just to avoid upsetting your partner, that's a major red flag that's clearly indicating a fundamentally unhealthy dynamic.
Exactly. A relationship that's built on a foundation of fear.
Right.
And constant self-censorship is simply not sustainable.
Right.
Nor is it emotionally fulfilling
Right.
in any meaningful way.
Okay.
So we've just outlined some pretty significant red flags that you might encounter. And that naturally leads to an important question.
Yeah.
If these warning signs are often quite apparent, at least when we look back or observe others,
Yeah.
why do we ourselves so often ignore them in the moment?
That's absolutely the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. It is.
I think that, our source offers some really insightful reasons why this happens. And I think one of the most common and powerful ones is simply hope for change.
Oh, yeah. Huge one.
When we enter relationships, we often carry this inherently optimistic belief
Right.
That even if we observe some problematic behaviors early on,
Yeah.
our love, our
Mm-hmm.
support,
Yeah.
or our influence will somehow inspire the other person to get better
Right.
or outgrow those behaviors over time.
Exactly. It's a
Yeah.
very natural
Right.
and deeply human tendency
Yeah.
to want to see the best in people
Right.
and to genuinely believe in the transformative power of love and connection.
Right.
However, relying solely on the hope that someone will fundamentally alter their ingrained behavior patterns
Yeah.
without them first actively acknowledging the issue and committing to working on it
Right.
is very often a recipe for disappointment
Right.
and even heartache.
Right.
These patterns of behavior are usually quite deeply rooted and not easily changed by wishful thinking alone.
Yeah. Another incredibly powerful reason
Hmm.
why we might ignore these glaring red flags
Yeah.
is the very real fear of being alone.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes the prospect of ending a relationship, even one that we know deep down,
Right.
is flawed or even unhealthy,
Mm-hmm.
feels significantly more frightening
Right.
than the perceived safety of staying within that familiar dynamic.
Absolutely.
There's this often incorrect and ultimately damaging thought that something, anything, is inherently better than nothing at all.
Yeah. And this fear can be particularly strong for individuals who have experienced prolonged periods of loneliness
Right.
in the past,
Well,
or who place a very high value on simply being in a relationship,
right.
regardless of its quality,
Right.
however consistently settling. For a relationship that makes you deeply unhappy,
Right.
constantly compromises your well-being,
Yeah.
or chips away at your self-esteem,
Right.
is rarely, if ever, the better option in the long run.
Right.
In fact, it can often lead to even greater unhappiness
Right.
and can actively prevent you from finding a truly fulfilling and healthy connection
Right.
with someone else down the road.
Right. And then there's also the very significant factor of emotional investment.
Yeah.
You know,
Huge one.
the longer you've been with someone,
Right.
the more shared experiences, the more intertwined your lives become,
Mm-hmm.
the more memories you create together, and often the more practical entanglements like shared finances or living situations
Right.
you accumulate.
Mm.
It can feel incredibly difficult and daunting to walk away
Yeah.
from that significant investment of time, energy, and emotion.
Yeah.
Even if the relationship is clearly trending in an unhealthy direction,
Mm-hmm.
it's a bit like the sunk cost fallacy in economics.
Right.
You've already put so much in.
Yeah.
You feel compelled to keep going,
Yeah.
regardless of the diminishing returns or the increasing damage to your well-being.
That's very apt and insightful analogy.
Yeah.
The sheer weight of that emotional investment can create a powerful inertia,
Right.
making it feel like the prospect of starting over,
Right.
of untangling your lives, is simply too overwhelming,
Right.
even if staying in the current situation
Right.
is causing you significant emotional damage.
Right.
And this reluctance to leave is often further complicated and reinforced by manipulation and gaslighting tactics, as our source astutely mentioned earlier.
Exactly. When a partner is actively engaging in manipulation or using gaslighting consistently, trying to make you doubt your own sense of reality,
Right.
invalidating your very real feelings,
Mm-hmm.
and eroding your confidence in your own judgment,
Yeah.
it becomes incredibly difficult to trust your own perception
Right.
of those red flags.
Exactly.
You might start to second guess yourself,
Right.
to believe that you are indeed overreacting, or even tragically, that the problems in the relationship are somehow all your fault.
This is precisely where that incredibly important reality check question our source poses becomes so vital.
Yeah.
Would I ever accept this kind of treatment or these behaviors if a close friend told me this was happening to them in their relationship?
Right.
And often we are far clearer, more objective, and certainly more compassionate when we're observing someone else's difficult situation.
Oh, absolutely.
So applying that same critical and compassionate lens to our own intimate relationships
Right.
can be a profoundly powerful way to break through denial,
Right.
to cut through the fog of emotional attachment, and to finally recognize the red flags
Right.
that we might have been desperately trying to ignore.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've spent some time talking about, what these relationship red flags are.
Right.
We've explored some of the most common ones that tend to get overlooked.
Yeah.
And we've also delved into some of the very complex reasons why we might find ourselves turning a blind eye to them.
Yeah.
Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about what you can actually actively do if you start noticing these warning signs cropping up in your own relationship.
Okay.
How do you begin to address them? Right.
And perhaps more importantly, how do you protect your own emotional well-being in the process?
So the very first step, and perhaps the most fundamentally crucial one, is to learn to trust your own gut instincts, that
Yeah.
inner voice,
Yeah.
that persistent feeling that something in the relationship is just off
Right.
or doesn't feel quite right is very often correct.
Mm.
Don't dismiss those intuitive nudges, those nagging feelings of unease. If something consistently feels wrong within the dynamic,
Yeah.
it's highly likely worth exploring more deeply
Right.
and paying close attention to.
Absolutely. Our intuition is often based on these very subtle cues,
Right.
on patterns of behavior and communication that our conscious mind hasn't fully processed or articulated yet.
Right.
So if you consistently find yourself feeling anxious, unusually uncomfortable, or emotionally drained after spending time with your partner,
Yeah.
pay close attention to those recurring feelings.
Yeah.
You know?
They're trying to tell you something. The next really crucial step, I think, as our source wisely suggests,
Right.
is to communicate clearly and directly.
Yes. And that involves being willing to set clear boundaries within the relationship and expressing your concerns openly and honestly
Right.
to your partner.
Right.
For example, if you feel like they're constantly checking up on you
Right.
in a way that feels intrusive and controlling,
Yeah.
you might calmly and directly say something like, I need to feel like I have my own personal space and a sense of trust in our relationship
Right.
without this constant monitoring.
Right.
And then, this is key,
Yeah.
you need to carefully observe how they react to your attempt
Yes.
to clearly establish a boundary and express a legitimate need.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Their reaction in that moment can be incredibly telling.
It can.
A respectful and healthy partner
Right.
will listen attentively to your concerns, will genuinely acknowledge your feelings as valid, and will ideally be willing to engage in a constructive discussion about how to move forward in a way that respects your needs.
Exactly.
Conversely, a partner who immediately dismisses your boundaries,
Right.
becomes defensive or hostile when you try to express your feelings,
Yeah.
or attempts to make you feel guilty for having needs or for asserting yourself, is unfortunately displaying yet another significant red flag
Absolutely.
in how they handle conflict.
Yeah.
And crucially, in their fundamental respect for your autonomy
Right.
and your well-being.
And, seeking an outside perspective from people you trust can also be an incredibly valuable step here.
Oh, yeah.
Talking openly with trusted friends, supportive family members, or perhaps even a therapist or counselor
Right.
can provide you with a more objective viewpoint on the situation
Right.
and can help you to see those relationship dynamics more clearly without the emotional entanglement that can sometimes cloud your judgment
Right.
when you're deeply involved.
Yeah, sometimes when you're right in the middle of a challenging situation, it can be very difficult to see the bigger picture.
Right.
Or to recognize patterns that might be obvious to someone on the outside.
That's so true. People who genuinely care about your well-being and who are not emotionally invested in this specific relationship
Right.
can often see potentially unhealthy patterns or problematic behaviors
Right.
that you, for various reasons we discussed earlier, might be inadvertently overlooking or actively rationalizing.
Right.
Yeah.
And then finally, and this can often be the most difficult step for many people, you need to be willing to walk away from the relationship.
Yeah.
If you have made sincere efforts to communicate your concerns clearly, if you have attempted to establish healthy boundaries, and yet the problematic behaviors persistently continue or even escalate despite your efforts,
Yeah.
you absolutely must prioritize your own emotional and even physical well-being.
Yes.
Above all else.
Exactly.
Sometimes, despite your best intentions and efforts, a particular relationship is simply not healthy.
Right.
Is not sustainable.
Yeah.
And is ultimately damaging to you.
Right.
Being willing to end a relationship, even a long-term one, in such circumstances, is not a sign of failure.
Right.
It is, in fact, a powerful act of self-respect,
Yeah.
self-preservation,
Absolutely.
and a necessary step towards finding healthier connections in the future.
That's it. And to reiterate, a key takeaway here from our sources, a healthy and thriving relationship
Right.
should ultimately make you feel fundamentally safe, genuinely valued for who you are, and consistently respected in your thoughts, your feelings,
Yeah.
and boundaries.
Yeah.
It should bring a sense of joy, support, and mutual growth into your life,
Yeah.
not constant anxiety, persistent emotional exhaustion,
Right.
or a pervasive feeling of being controlled or diminished.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think, as we begin to kind of wrap up our deep dive for today,
Okay.
We have explored what relationship red flags are. We've
Uh-huh.
highlighted some of the most common and often insidious ones that we tend to ignore. Things like, the initial intensity of love bombing,
Right.
the subtle creep of controlling behavior,
Yeah.
the damaging impact of a lack of accountability,
Mhm.
the violation of personal boundaries,
Right.
and that very pervasive and unsettling feeling of constantly walking on eggshells.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
We've also taken a look at some of the complex reasons why we might find ourselves ignoring these crucial warning signs.
Right.
And most importantly, we've discussed some concrete steps that you can take to address these issues if they arise in your own relationships
Right.
and how to actively protect your own well-being.
Exactly.
So we really encourage you to take some time to reflect on all of this information and to honestly consider its potential relevance to your own experiences,
Mhm.
whether in current relationships or even in those from your past. Developing the ability to recognize these red flags early on can be an incredibly valuable skill
Right.
and can potentially save you a significant amount of unnecessary heartache and emotional distress down
Yeah.
the road.
And as a final thought for you to consider, always remember that healthy and true love should ultimately be an uplifting and supportive force in your life.
Yeah.
It should be a consistent source of strength, mutual growth, and genuine happiness.
Mm-hmm.
Not something that constantly drains your energy,
Yeah.
attempts to control your choices,
Right.
or makes you consistently question your own inherent worth.
Yeah.
That kind of healthy and respectful connection is absolutely something worth holding out for.
Right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, until next time, happy diving.
Yeah. Take care.
Bye.